What's up, guys? This video is going to be on my Pelikan M200 nib unit flex modification. The last video I did on this kind of, I just finished doing a lot of, I spent hours actually doing the work on the nib. I was kind of tired. I felt like I was a little bit rambly. I was a little, for lack of a better term, kind of all over the place, and I know a lot of people complain about my videos being too long and stuff, so I figured I would do a reduction video, basically kind of going over exactly what I did with the nib, certain problems that I came across, and stuff like that, just more to the point, more in-depth, specifically about the nib itself. First off, I want to start by saying the reason why I did this modification. I like the M600, M200 nibs fit in here, and my writing experience with the M200 nibs has been that they're basically the softest nibs, steel nibs that I've ever written with, compared to other companies who put out nibs with, made out of steel instead of a more flexible 14 karat gold or whatnot. And I thought, maybe if I grind a nib in a certain way, I can get it to flex, more than what it normally does. Now, here I have a spare nib unit. This one happens to be a fine. And if you look at it, you can see that even without putting too much pressure down, the tines will basically spread. Now, as I was looking at this nib unit and trying to figure out what the best way to grind it was, some people, they'll just grind scallops on the behind the shoulders of the nibs. I know, Pilot for their FA Falcon nib, for their 742 or 743, whatever, that's what they do, and you can get some flexibility, some tine spread with the nib that way. In my case, I just kind of just bent the nib down, as I was writing with it and I was just playing around with it. I was just looking, and as I was bending the nib down, I was looking at what point of the nib, what point of the metal was actually causing the tines to stop spreading. And I realized that, around this shoulder area here, you could just see like the metal in this area here starting to flex and move, and because of how the shoulders are bent over this way, I thought that that's probably what's keeping these tines from spreading even more, because it's not like the metal itself is very stiff. The metal itself is actually quite soft. So with the nib, I went ahead and I ground the shoulders down. There are different nib meisters that will grind 14K gold nibs. I know Richard Binder will grind M400 nibs for Pelikans, and he does a variety of things. He brings down the shoulder, he thins out the metal where the tines are. I believe he'll also play around with the tempering of the nib itself. I didn't do any of that. I'll just actually go to the nib itself. If you look here, normally the shoulders are just in line with the breather hole of the nib. In this case, I actually brought the shoulders further back. I brought them basically to where the lettering, if you look at the Pelikan M200 nib, where it says Pelikan there, that's where I brought the shoulders down on both sides, as you can see there. And then I also thinned down the profile of the tines itself. You can see here I had a ground, I filed off some of the feet there. Basically what had happened is, as I was messing around with getting the nib and feet out of the collar, I accidentally crushed several of the fins, and it looked kind of ugly, so I decided, let me just file away the crushed fins. The feet is made out of plastic, and I was using a Dremel the entire time, with a sanding wheel, a coarse sanding wheel. So you can see it kind of melted a little bit. It doesn't look the best. I could definitely finish that off a little better, but it looks better than the standard feed with just half of the fins just crushed downwards towards the body of the pen. I also used the same sanding wheel on a Dremel to cut down bring down the shoulders and also thin out the tines. If you could take a look at the tines here, you can kind of see the difference between the two. Like so, to somewhere with better lighting. Problems that I'd run across, I noticed that as I thinned out the tines, the tines themselves actually started to spread out more. When I inspected the nib from the factory, the tines were basically just touching at the very tip. Right now, the way they are after I thinned out the shoulders and the tines, they're just perfectly in line. And this was after me actually bending them inwards a little bit. So now they're perfectly in line. They're not quite touching. And what happened was that it would cause a slight break in capillary action at the very tip of the nib, and that in turn caused almost like a baby's bottom problem. In the previous video I had shown I was having some hard start issues where the ink wasn't flowing properly. And normally with Pelikan nibs, flow I figured wouldn't really be an issue because Pelikan nibs write very wet. So when I could get proper ink flow and I could start the pen writing on the paper, then as I was flexing, no matter how much flexing I did or at what speed I was doing, I wouldn't get any flow issues. I wouldn't really get any railroading. One caveat to that is that I did get railroading when I pushed the nib too far. And what I had ended up doing was I had actually sprung this nib. I was messing around, kind of testing the limits. Right now, the way the nib flexes, it's very soft. This is as soft, if not just a hair softer than my Waterman 92 nib, which, granted, I don't really consider it's probably not a wet noodle, but it is a full flex nib that is quite soft and quite easy to flex. So I was pushing a little harder. I was actually pushing this nib harder than I normally would have with my Waterman, and I ended up springing the tines, and the tines basically just kind of stayed upward at a slight angle, breaking contact with the feed, so there was no flow. At that point, I had to pop the nib off the feed, out of the collar again, and kind of, because it is steel and it didn't crack or anything, I just kind of bent it back into place. And the way I have it right now, I have the nib slightly, I don't know if you can see, it's not completely straight. It's slightly bent down at an angle. And that's another thing that I did to try and keep the tips of the tines touching each other. I had actually noticed that with a lot of, with both my vintage pens, the Waterman and my Rexall, towards the very tip of the tines, they were all bent slightly at a downward angle. And, that meant that you had a nice big gap in between the tines for really heavy wet flow, but you wouldn't break any capillary action because the tines were basically pointed downwards, and capillary action would work in your favor and help keep flow proper. Other than that, getting the nib out of the collar was not that bad. I had used basically a very quickly improvised nib block, and I tapped the bottom of the feed to push it out of the collar. Getting it back into the collar was kind of a pain. It was quite difficult. Eventually I kind of got the hang of how to force it in. The thing with this nib is that, unlike with the Pilot Custom 74 nib, there's no indexing points on the nib to the feed, so you kind of have to hold both in alignment in the proper position and then just push everything back into the collar. And the first few times I did it was actually a bit of a struggle, but after basically having to realign everything a few times, now I can kind of have a good feel of how to line everything up. In terms of the performance, you can see here I have a sheet that I've been messing around with there. Since I've had it open, I would not be surprised if I actually had some hard starting issues, but we will see. Actually, I'm actually at the very last page of this Rhodia pad, but let me just get a nice clean sheet there. So, yeah, not surprised. Bit of a hard start at first because I have had the pen open for a few minutes now, but right now it's okay. What I had actually done was I had also ground the tipping on the sides a little bit. Because the tines started spreading out more, it made for a much broader line, and you wouldn't really get as much line variation when you flexed, because instead of being more of an extra fine, granted it was more already like a fine. Pelikan doesn't really make great extra fines from my experience. It became more of like a fine to medium, like a very wider fine. So I just ground the edges of the tipping down more so that it would generate a smaller line even though the spacing between the tines was much greater. So right now you can see, again, if I'm waving it around, the nib will dry, but after it starts writing, I took care of the baby's bottom by using micro mesh. After I ground off the sides, I use my micro mesh to polish off the edge of the nib. And right now, I no longer have any hard start issues. I can just do the weight of the pen, and you can see it has no problems writing. So basically, no pressure side to side, no pressure up and down, and then I start flexing. Right now, as it is, I would not flex more than that. I'll bring it up for a bit of an up close. You can see, the line variation. You at least like double or triple the line width. I could push this nib more, but as I found out when I sprung the nib the first time, is when I pushed this to its maximum, which is probably maybe, I'd say the maximum spread was like maybe this wide total. Just a hair beyond that, and I sprung the nib. So right now, I don't really intend on pushing any more than this. I feel like when you're using a flex nib, you don't really want to always get the biggest swells that you can. You do want a nice balance between your hairlines and your flexy parts on your downward strokes, and that looks the best. So the way this nib writes right now, I'm quite happy with. No flow issues, no real railroading issues, so long as you don't push it too hard. It will write with no problems, so long as the ink is flowing to the paper. What I mean is, when it was baby bottoming, and you tried spreading the tines right away, instead of actually starting to write a smaller line and then spreading it out, there would be no ink flow whatsoever, because if you look at a flex nib, what happens a lot of times is once it railroads, you actually have a very thin layer of ink in between the two tines, and that just, like, that bubble kind of just bursts and pops, and then you no longer have any ink flow. What I found is after I removed the baby's bottom, once I got it to start writing and capillary action was making contact between the nib and the paper, then I could write to my heart's content with no problems whatsoever. And you can see, like, I'm flexing on every downstroke. Granted, I'm not doing very huge swells, but I am, oops, out of frame. But I am flexing on every downstroke, and I could go at a relatively quick speed with no issues whatsoever with flow. And, it is quite wet. So there we go. Very nice. That's basically it. I'm not really sure how much more I'm gonna do with this nib. Since I do have a second one, I probably will redo this. Try not to screw up the fins, and try and make it look a little cleaner, a little neater. This time, try not to spring the nib first. After I sprung the nib, I kind of bent all the tines and everything back into place, back into alignment, and it works because the way the metal has memory, it's holding that memory, but I do feel that it is going to weaken the material, and over time, if you repeatedly spring it, you'll either crack a tine, or you won't be able to bend it back, or it just won't flex anymore. It'll lose that, like, the memory that steel has. So I'll probably end up doing this and make it a much neater package. I think I may also trim the feed underneath where the thinned out tines are, so when you look from the top you don't actually see exposed feed, but that's not something I'm gonna exactly do right now. The way this nib is set up now, I'm actually quite happy with. I can write with it. I can do most of the flexible writing that I want in a convenient piston filler in a modern pen, and I don't have to worry about necessarily breaking any expensive vintage gold flex nibs or having to deal with resacking any of the vintage lever fillers or whatever. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this more reduced video, and I apologize again about the whole rambling. I'll leave that older rambling video up because I do feel that I do convey some useful information, but when I went over the video again, I felt like I missed out on certain steps that I had done. and also it took me quite a long time to actually get to the point. So that's why I'm doing this video now. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Again, standard disclaimer, if you plan on doing this, do it at your own risk. You know, I take no responsibility. For me, it was a risk. If I screwed it up, then I would have basically wasted $30. It's up to you to decide whether you want to do this or not. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you learned something, and thanks